Welcome back to another week of Adult Sunday School here at Holy Cross Lutheran Church. We are continuing in our study of the book of Acts as we follow the followers of Jesus to see what they get up to after Jesus' ascension into heaven. We are coming to the end of our study. We've only got a couple more weeks left, and here we are today in Acts chapter 25. So we have been following Paul as, well, he's been in prison. We left him off in custody in Caesarea, awaiting trial before the procurator Antonius Felix. And that never got resolved because after 2 years waiting in prison, Felix gets replaced by Porcius Festus. And Paul is still in custody, still waiting for his trial, when all Paul really wants to do is go to Rome, like the Spirit told him he was going to do. And so that's where we left Paul. Festus gets to Caesarea, and Paul's still in prison. So let's dive in with Acts chapter 25. 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. So I'm going to stop really quick today. Festus is heading to Jerusalem to either pay his respects to the Jewish religious leadership or to be paid respects by the Jewish religious leadership. Festus ended up being a much better procurator than Mr. Corrupt Antonius Felix, but Festus also didn't make very many friends as procurator because he reacted to rebellions fairly harshly. There's also an interesting comedic episode. It actually happened, but it sounds like comedy, in which Agrippa II, who is king of Judea at this point, we'll talk about him in a bit, he built a wall in Jerusalem. And the Jewish leaders turned around and built a bigger wall. And Festus didn't like the bigger wall, so he had the Jewish leaders' wall torn down. They appealed to Emperor Nero, who decided in their favor against Festus. But before anything could be done about the way Festus handled this wall, he died in 62 AD. He also probably did quite a bit to contribute to the upcoming Jewish-Roman War, which will start in 66 AD, because Festus liked to put down rebellions rather harshly. So because of that, it didn't build any trust between Rome and Jerusalem. So, moving on. What happened in Jerusalem? The chief priests and Jewish leaders presented their case against Paul. Appealing to him, they asked as a favor from Festus that he summon Paul to Jerusalem. They were planning to ambush and kill him along the way. But Festus responded by keeping Paul in Caesarea, since he was to return there very soon himself. "Some of your leaders can come down with me," he said. "If he's done anything wrong, they can bring charges against him." So even after 2 years, it seems like one of the biggest things on the Jewish leaders' minds is Paul, who has for 2 years been sitting in prison at this point. But very first time they meet Procurator Festus, they bring up Paul. And Festus doesn't want to deal with Paul in Jerusalem. He's probably a bit confused as to who this guy is and why the Jewish leaders care about him so much. So eventually, they get around to dealing with everything in Caesarea. And that's what's about to happen. Verse 6. He stayed with them for no more than 8 or 10 days, then went down to Caesarea. The following day, he took his seat in the court and ordered that Paul be brought in. When he arrived, many Jews who had come down from Jerusalem surrounded him. They brought serious charges against him, but they couldn't prove them. In his own defense, Paul said, "I've done nothing wrong against the Jewish law, against the temple, or against Caesar." I mean, that's as close to a simple summary of basically the events of the past 2 years now as you can get. The Jewish leaders are bringing kind of nonsense charges against Paul. Paul's defense is basically that these charges are nonsense, and it's almost exactly the same as the trial before Felix that we heard about last week, but Paul experienced 2 years before. And it's kind of a mess, because I think even Festus knows that these are nonsense charges. Verse 9, Festus, wanting to put the Jews in his debt, asked Paul, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem to stand trial before me concerning these things?" So Festus knows that the situation in Jerusalem is already getting feisty between the Jews and the Romans, and in trying to kind of win some points with the Jewish leaders in his first 2 weeks in office, he wants to see if Paul's willing to stand trial in Jerusalem. But remember, Paul really wants to go to Rome. And last time I checked, Jerusalem isn't Rome. So Paul's got something that he's been sitting on in his back pocket, and he's getting ready to play it. So verse 10, Paul replied, "I'm standing before Caesar's court. I ought to be tried here. I've done nothing wrong to the Jews, as you well know. If I'm guilty and have done something that deserves death, then I won't try to avoid death. But if there is nothing to their accusations against me, no one has the authority to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar." After Festus conferred with his advisors, he responded, "You've appealed to Caesar you will go." Paul wants to go to Rome. Caesar's in Rome. And because he's a Roman citizen, Paul has a real easy way now to get to Rome. I mean, it's been 2 years. He's probably incredibly impatient to get to Rome. And this is probably the fastest way. And Festus conferred with his advisors. I'm pretty sure part of that process was making sure that Paul is a Roman citizen like he says he is. I don't know exactly what the process was for determining if someone was a citizen or not, but the important part is it seems like Paul's claim to citizenship has been holding up, because if Paul was falsely claiming citizenship, Paul would be real easy to get rid of, because the penalty for falsely claiming citizenship was death. And Paul's not dead yet. So it seems like there's something to his claims of citizenship. And here Paul is using one of those rights of being a Roman citizen to get himself tried, not in Caesarea, not in Jerusalem, but before Caesar in Rome. But there's a conundrum, and we'll find out about this conundrum in, well, a couple verses actually. But first, we get to meet some new people whose lives are crazy, and I think it's worth finding out about these two people's crazy lives. So continuing on with verse 13. After several days had passed, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived in Caesarea to welcome Festus. Okay, so I'm just going to warn you, things are going to get a little bit crazy here. So I'm going to start with the easy thing. Agrippa is really Agrippa II, the son of Herod Agrippa I from Acts chapter 12. This is the guy, Agrippa I, who died after he was acclaimed a god and chose not to refute that claim. And so both the Bible and I think Josephus assert that God struck him down for not refuting this godhood that someone claimed at him. And Agrippa II had only somewhat recently become king of Judea. I mean, it's awkward because he's not really king of Judea. He's king of like everything but Judea. It's a mess. And really his kingship is barely a kingdom. He's a Roman client. And so he doesn't have a lot of power, but he still gets to sound like he has a lot of power. It's super complicated. This happened a lot in Rome. But Agrippa II was, he was an okay king. He wasn't near as terrible as some of the other Herods, because his full name is Herod Agrippa. He wasn't near as terrible as some of the other Agrippas. But the one who had a really interesting life is his sister, Bernice. Bernice and Agrippa were subject to a whole bunch of incredibly scandalous rumors. Bernice had been married twice, and both of her husbands had died. And after her second husband died, she moved into her brother's palace. And while there were a lot of rumors about, let's call it inappropriate sibling behavior. And many of these rumors are actually mentioned by Josephus, which makes it interesting because Herod Agrippa II and Josephus were actually really good friends. And so it's kind of weird that Agrippa would let his friend include these rumors about him and his sister up to inappropriate things, which makes you kind of wonder if Agrippa was covering... He either was covering up something that was more scandalous than being inappropriate with his sister, or he thought the whole thing was funny and told Josephus to leave it in because he thought it was hilarious. That seems like really the only two options to me, because he was such good friends with Josephus, a guy who wrote down some of these rumors. But the rumors persisted, so to try to quash these rumors, she rather quickly marries a third guy. Neither of them were really into getting married, and that marriage fell apart very quickly, so she moved back into the palace with Agrippa. Now, while she's there, she and Agrippa shared power quite equally, which is weird for that time, for a man and woman to share power, but that's how they functioned. Agrippa ended up being deposed in 66 at the beginning of the Jewish-Roman War. Bernice, oddly enough, ends up hooking up with a general named Titus. He is the son of the general in charge of the Roman forces in the Jewish-Roman War. Their relationship continued on and off until that general named Titus became Emperor Titus. And at that point, he broke off their affair because she probably wasn't the most appropriate person to be empress. It's a little, it's different when you're a general versus when you're the emperor. So that's a whole lot of drama about Agrippa II and Bernice, but it just gives you a little bit of background on what's going on here. And so these brother and sister rulers, they get to Caesarea to greet the newly arrived Festus. And they want to know about all this nonsense going on. Honestly, I could just see Festus coming in going, oh man, what do you know about this Paul guy? Why is he such a big deal? So in verse 14, Festus starts into a really good summary of the events dealing with Paul up to this point, including giving us some really interesting extra details. So verse 14. Since they were staying there for many days, Festus discussed the case against Paul with the king. He said, "There is a man whom Felix left in prison. When I was in Jerusalem, the Jewish chief priests and elders brought charges against him and requested a guilty verdict in his case. I told them it's contrary to Roman practice to hand someone over before they have faced their accusers and had opportunity to offer a defense against the charges. When they came here, I didn't put them off. The very next day, I took my seat in the court and ordered that the man be brought before me. When the accusers took the floor, they didn't charge him with any of the crimes I'd expected. Instead, they quibbled with him about their own religion and some dead man named Jesus, who Paul claimed was alive. Since I have no idea how to investigate these matters, I asked if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem to stand trial there on these issues. However, Paul appealed that he be held in custody, pending a decision from His Majesty the Emperor. So I ordered that he be held until I could send him to Caesar. You kind of get where Festus is coming from here. He just got to Jerusalem. He's still trying to figure out what's going on here. He probably has some idea of the tensions between the Romans and the Jews. He probably has some idea of what the situation is. But he gets there, and for the first 3 weeks, he's dealing with this Paul guy who isn't a terrorist, but everybody's treating him as if he is. And he's perplexed that the whole thing with Paul seems to be about what he calls some dead guy named Jesus that Paul claims is still alive. Like, can you imagine, thinking that, what could this Paul guy have possibly done wrong that everyone cares about him so much? What could he have done that he's been locked up without trial for 2 years? And it all turns out to be what he would think as pagan religious quibbles. He's so confused. He has no idea what to do with Paul, because we actually get this really great scene in the next section of verses that shows us Festus has no idea what to do about Paul. So verse 22, Agrippa said to Festus, I want to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, Festus replied, you will hear him. The next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great fanfare. They entered the auditorium with the military commanders and the city's most prominent men. Festus ordered that Paul be brought in. Festus said, King Agrippa and everyone present with us, you see this man. The entire Jewish community, both here and in Jerusalem, has appealed to me concerning him. They've been calling for his immediate death. I've found that he has done nothing deserving death. When he appealed to His Majesty, I decided to send him to Rome. I have nothing definite to write to our Lord Emperor. Therefore, I've brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after this investigation, I might have something to write. After all, it would be foolish to send a prisoner without specifying the charges against him. So imagine yourself in Festus's position here. Festus has this prisoner who, as far as he's concerned, hasn't broken any laws, hasn't done anything wrong. He's just living his life, but he's been imprisoned for 2 years awaiting trial. That prisoner is a Roman citizen and has exercised their right as a Roman citizen to have their case heard by the emperor, Nero. And now Festus has to come up with what to tell the emperor the charges against Paul are. Because, and here's where it gets really messy, Caesar kind of functions not just as a political figure, but also as a religious figure. This actually became one of the major problems with the early church, because the early church said, Jesus is Lord, which means Caesar is not Lord. And that caused a big stir. But right now, the only charges that Festus has against Paul are, he says that a Jesus guy that's dead is alive. And that's not really illegal at all. And he's got maybe some religious charges, some stuff about, like, I don't know, defiling the temple maybe, but that's nonsense. He knows that the charges from the Jews are nonsense. They just want to get rid of Paul for reasons. But now Festus has to write a letter to Nero explaining what this case is that Paul once tried before him, explaining what Paul has done wrong. And Festus is going, I have absolutely no idea what this guy did wrong. As far as I'm concerned, he hasn't done anything wrong. So help me out, everybody, especially you, King Agrippa. What do I write to Caesar about Paul? And so the next thing that happens is Agrippa said to Paul, you may speak for yourself. And I don't at all apologize for this, but next week we'll find out what Paul says in his defense. Because this is really about the only place I could split up this section of readings. So, no apologies for the cliffhanger. I hope you enjoy it. And next week we will pick up with Paul's defense before Agrippa and Festus so that they can hopefully figure out what to write to Caesar about Paul. So thank you for joining us as we have been studying Acts. If you have anything you want to add to the discussion or have some questions that you want to ask, leave them in the comments below and I'll get back to you quickly. And until next time, I hope you have a wonderful week. God bless.